Hi everyone, thanks for joining. Today I'm going to be doing a video about another serial killer who eluded law enforcement for many years before being identified and ultimately captured. His name is Dennis Rader, but he was known as BTK. Dennis Rader killed 10 people in the Wichita, Kansas area between the years of 1974 and 1991, and then would be identified many years later. Dennis Lynn Rader was an American serial killer born March 9th of 1945 in Pittsburgh, Kansas. His father was William Rader and his mother Dorothea Rader, and he was the oldest of 4 boys. He had a brother Paul that was 2 years younger, a brother Bill that was 4 years younger, I believe, and a brother Jeff that was 10 years younger. When Dennis was young, the family moved to Wichita, Kansas, and his upbringing doesn't show any type of known abuse or neglect. He came from a very religious household. They all went to church. They were Boy Scouts. Dennis at a young age was a Boy Scout as well. He enjoyed activities with the youth group with his church. He went to Riverview Elementary School in Wichita and is reported to be an average student, though he did have withdrawn tendencies according to people from his past. At a very young age, Dennis began having fantasies of bondage and torture, dark fantasies that he admitted. And as he grew older, he would fantasize about tying girls up and having his way with them. Dennis also would kill cats and dogs as a young child by hanging them. One memory that stuck out for Dennis was one day when his mother got her ring caught in the couch, and as she realized that her hand was stuck and she was unable to free herself, she became frantic and started yelling for Dennis to help her. And during this time, she was unaware of it, of course, but Dennis realized that he liked the idea of watching her helpless and in fear. And that was one of the first times that he remembered really being exposed to those feelings of wanting to control women and see them helpless and in fear. And as a teenager, Dennis would bind his own hands and feet and sometimes put a bag over his head to restrict his breathing as a way of living out his fantasies of things that he wanted to do to others. He would also cut out magazine clippings of women that he found attractive, and he would draw on gags and nooses onto these pictures of women. Dennis graduated from Wichita Heights High School in 1963. He would go on in 1965 to attend a local community college. He was described as a mediocre student with poor grades, never really excelled at all anytime, high school or college. His journals would reveal that at this time, after starting community college, is when he would actively begin trolling for his victims. In 1966, Dennis joined the Air Force and would serve in the Air Force until 1970, and then he went on to serve 2 more years in the reserves. On May 22nd of 1971, Dennis married his wife Paula, and they moved to Park City, Kansas. Around that time, he worked a few low-level jobs in and around the area, and later would attend another community college. And in 1973, he earned an associate's degree in electronics. He would go on in the fall of 1973 to attend Wichita State University, and there he took night courses for 6 years before he earned a degree there. And his grades were consistently lacking in the C's and D's range. Dennis had very poor grammar, and his lack of grammar skills would show later on when he began communicating with law enforcement and local news stations. In 1973, he was let go from yet another job and admitted at this time that he became very eager to act out his fantasies of bondage, torture towards women. At that time, his wife worked in Wichita, which was, I believe, like 9 miles from where they lived. And oftentimes Dennis would drive her to work and pick her up. And this is when he began to really troll, is what he called it, troll for his victims. His sick fantasies would turn to reality in 1974 when Dennis was trolling a neighborhood after dropping off his wife at work and saw 34-year-old Julie Otero and her 11-year-old daughter Josephine outside their home in Wichita. And Dennis knew at that point that he wanted them to be his first actual victims. And so he began planning from that point on. Part of the planning was for Dennis to create what he called a hit kit. And in this hit kit, he had knives, cords, a gun, tools to gain entry into homes, things like that, that he would use for his future victims. Dennis would observe the family for a period of time to learn their routine and things like that. And after kind of watching and observing for a little while, Dennis states that his sexual fantasies became too strong to control. On the morning of January 15th, 1974, Dennis approached the Otero family home in Wichita, Kansas, and he cut the phone lines. He made his way to the back of the house to gain entry through the back door, and even admits that for a short moment he contemplated aborting his mission, but ultimately went into the back door. He used a gun to gain control of the family. And what Dennis didn't realize is that Julie and her daughter Josephine were not the only ones home at this time, but in fact her husband Joseph, who was 38, and their son Joseph Jr., who was 9, were also at home. He then ordered them to a back bedroom where he tied up their hands and feet and would attempt to strangle each one of them with a bag over their head. His plan ended up kind of going a little haywire. So then Dennis again focused on Mr. Otero, where he put a plastic bag over his head and strangled him, and then would move on to Mrs. Otero again, and then Josephine, and then Joseph Jr. was taken into another bedroom where he was strangled. When Dennis returned to the other room where the parents and Josephine were, he realized that Josephine had come to, just like the family members previously had, and he took her down to the basement where he placed a noose around her neck and hung her from a sewer pipe. He told her not to worry because she would soon be in heaven with the others. After Josephine was gone, Dennis masturbated on an article of clothing which he left in the basement. Then he proceeded to tidy up and collect all the items from his hit kit, and he also stole a watch and a small radio for whatever reason before leaving the home. Unfortunately, the Otero's older children, Charlie was 15, Daniel was 14, and Carmen was 13. They would later come home from school and be the ones to find their parents. About a month later, Dennis would write a local media called the Wichita Eagle and describe in it in detail how he had murdered the Otero family as a way to taunt them. And Dennis was a fucking narcissist. Dennis was a piece of shit, but he was a narcissist who wanted attention and wrote this letter to claim fame, I guess. A few months later, Dennis would claim his next victim. He identified who his victim would be in the same method that he had previously with Mrs. Otero and her daughter, and happened to be driving by and saw this woman and decided this is going to be my next victim. So after watching this woman for a short period of time, on April 4th of 1974, Dennis would break into the home of 21-year-old Catherine Bright and wait there for her to return. At about 2 p.m., Catherine returned with her 19-year-old brother, Kevin, and Dennis later had stated that he was a little bit surprised to see her brother there. So he again produced a gun to gain control. He forced them both into a bedroom and had Kevin tie his sister up, and then Dennis proceeded to tie Kevin up. He moved Catherine to another room and then came back to where Kevin was and realized that he had freed himself from the restraints. So the two of them ended up struggling, and Kevin was ultimately fighting for his life. And in the struggle, Dennis was able to shoot him once. Once he saw Kevin go down and noticed blood and realized that he had in fact shot him, he returned to Catherine with the intent to strangle her, and realized that she too had freed herself. So the two of them struggled as well. During the struggle, Dennis was able to render Catherine unconscious, and shortly after that he heard Kevin in the other room. When he went back into the other room, another struggle ensued, and Dennis later would state that during this second struggle with Kevin, nearly was able to take control of his gun, but ultimately during this second struggle, Dennis again shot him, this time I believe in the face. Dennis returned to Catherine, and she too had gained consciousness, and a second struggle began between the two of them, and Dennis began to panic. So instead of strangling Catherine, he stabbed her once in the back and once in the abdomen. By some miracle, being out in the other room and shot one time in the head and one time in the face, Kevin actually was still alive, and during this time was able to escape the house. So when Dennis went back out after stabbing Catherine, he realized that Kevin was gone and panicked and quickly gathered his items and left the home. So in October of 1974, Dennis would call the editor of the Wichita Eagle and direct him to a book, I believe it was an engineering book, in the local Wichita library. The editor, for fear of messing up the investigation, notified the police. Police arrived, and a letter was found by police in this engineering book depicting details of the Otero murders and taking responsibility. At the end of the letter, Dennis said, "The code word for me will be bind them, torture them, kill them, BTK." And this is ultimately how Dennis Rader earned the moniker BTK. So the following month, Dennis began working for ADT Security Company and would stay there for 14 years. And it's said that during the time that he was killing his victims and working for ADT, that Dennis was actually installing security systems in homes for people that wanted security systems for fear of the BTK. On July 27th of 1975, Dennis would have his first child, Brian, and nearly 2 years, I believe, went by after the birth of his son before Dennis would claim another victim, though he admits that he continued trolling for victims the entire time that he was on a hiatus. On March 17th of 1977, Dennis could no longer control his urge to kill, and Dennis would drive to a woman named Cheryl's home that he had briefly met and kind of had on his radar as a potential next victim. Well, when Dennis arrived at her house, she was not home, and after waiting for a little bit, he lost patience and decided to leave. While walking the neighborhood, Dennis came across a 5-year-old named Steve Relford, who was returning from the store after running an errand for his mom. He approached the young boy and showed him photos, I believe from his wallet, of maybe his family, and asked, "Do you know who they are?" as a means to kind of strike up a conversation really quick. And then, of course, the boy had no idea who they were, and so he went on his way to return home to his mom. And after that, Dennis discreetly followed the boy to his home where his 24-year-old mom, Shirley Relford, lived. Once the boy was inside, Dennis approached the house and knocked on the door, and the little boy answered. Dennis then kind of pretended to be a police officer to gain entry to the house. Once he was inside, he took control and actually told Shirley that he was there to fulfill a sexual fantasy that he had, and that he was going to tie her up and sexually assault her. He then forced her to help him tie up 5-year-old Steve and his 8-year-old brother and 4-year-old sister, and then proceeded to have her help him take the children into the bathroom, where he would lock them in there So at this time, Shirley was sick, was feeling under the weather. After locking the kids in the bathroom, Dennis tied her up, and as he prepared to kill her, Shirley became sick and vomited. So Dennis allowed her a little break to have some water. He said he comforted her, and after a little time passed, Dennis continued to tie her up, and then he placed a bag over her head and would strangle her. Unfortunately for these children, the bathroom was adjacent to the bedroom that Dennis and Shirley were in, so they could hear everything that was going on, and there are some reports that the door was, as they were trying to escape and screaming and banging, the door would kind of crack open a little bit, even though it had ties on the doorknobs from the outside, and they could actually see what was going on. And though he did not end up killing these 3 children, they watched their mother lose her life to an evil piece of shit. And that ultimately is something that they'll never be able to unsee. After Dennis killed Shirley, he masturbated onto a pair of her underwear, which were left behind as evidence, like the Otero case. But back in the 1970s, they didn't have the DNA capabilities like they do today. But of course, it was collected and saved in the evidence. During this time, the kids were getting increasingly more panicked and banging on the door trying to escape the bathroom when the telephone rang, and Dennis became panicked, thinking that somebody was going to show up. So he quickly again collected his hit kit items and fled the scene. Months later, Dennis would lay eyes on his next victim, who he began to stalk to, like the previous, understand their move, their schedule, things like that. But then on December 8th of 1977, Dennis entered the home of 25-year-old Nancy Fox, and she wasn't home at the time, so he cut the phone lines and actually waited in her house for her to arrive. When she returned, he again used a gun to gain control and let her know that he had a sexual problem and that he was there to fulfill that problem. Nancy became extremely upset, so Dennis, again, like the previous case, he actually allowed her a little bit of time to calm down, and she had a cigarette and they chatted briefly, and then at one point she said, "Okay, let's get this over with." So Dennis then used handcuffs from his hit kit, and he handcuffed her and tied up her feet, and then removed a belt that he was actually wearing to strangle her. And then Dennis proceeded to remove the belt and the ties on her feet and replaced both of them with pantyhose. He then masturbated onto Nancy's nightgown and collected his things like the previous and left. The following day, Dennis called the local law enforcement from a payphone and reported Nancy's murder. On February 10th of 1978, local media Cake, K-A-K-E TV received a 4-page letter from Dennis. And in this letter, Dennis complained about the lack of media cover. There again is his narcissistic tendencies just coming out. In this letter, he said, "How many do I have to kill to get a name in the paper or some national attention?" Also in the 4-page letter, he described Nancy's murder and the Otero murders and Shirley's murder. He also stated in the letter that there was a factor X, which was the reason that he needed to kill. And he also included a poem to Nancy titled "Oh Nancy." In June of 1978, Dennis would have his second child, and this time it was a girl named Carrie. This time he did not take a 2-year hiatus before moving on to his next victim. So in early 1979, a woman named Anna nearly became Dennis's next victim. He had spotted her and at one point broke into her home and waited for her. But while waiting, he became impatient and ended up leaving. And a few months later, he sent her a package. So in the package was a letter to Anna titled, "Oh Anna, why didn't you appear?" He also included a drawing that he had drawn depicting what he wanted to do to her, with like a noose and drawn on it and stuff like that, and a few items, small items that he had stolen from her house while he was there waiting for her arrival, just to basically let her know that he in fact was there, and to inflict fear. The local media also received the same package, and poor Anna, she never felt safe again and ultimately moved away after a short period of time. So over 5 years would pass before Dennis's next victim, or at least that we know of. But during these 5 years, he admits that he was actively trolling and that the thoughts of torture and the urges never went away. The next murder would take place on April 27th of 1985. This victim was Dennis's neighbor that had lived down the street, 53-year-old Maureen Hedge. And apparently, you know, like while walking the dog and out with the kids and stuff, they had actually like waved to each other and had small chit chat. So on this evening, Dennis was actually chaperoning one of his son's Boy Scout troops overnight camp out, and he claimed to have a headache and made up an excuse to leave the camp out briefly to go to town to get some quote-unquote meds for his headache. So he left the camp out, went back into town near where they lived, and parked at the local bowling alley. And then he would put beer on his clothes and swish beer in his mouth and call a taxi to pretend to be too drunk to drive. And he had the taxi take him to a park nearby where he claimed he wanted to sober up. The park was actually adjoined to Maureen's backyard. So Dennis came through the backyard, he cut the phone lines, he gained entry through the back door. Maureen was not home at the time, so he hid in the house while he waited for her arrival. And unbeknownst to him, she came home with a male friend. So a few hours would go by and Dennis stayed and waited while they, visited and stuff. Once the male friend left, Dennis then waited for her to fall asleep. And once he was sure that she was asleep, he climbed on top of her and began choking her in her sleep. So after Dennis killed this poor woman, he put her in the trunk of her own car and drove to his own church, where he took her down into the basement and posed her in different poses and took Polaroid pictures of her in these different poses in the basement of his own church. I mean, it's like the devil in disguise, right? Then he returned her to the trunk and drove off somewhere and placed her in a ditch where he covered her with a little bit of brush and left some knotted pantyhose behind. He then went back to the bowling alley where his car was, left her car there, and then took his car. Now at this time it was slowly becoming light outside, and so Dennis kind of became a little bit frantic because when he had left the camp out, it was getting late, so he knew everybody was falling asleep, and he desperately wanted to return to the Boy Scout camp out before anybody woke up, as to not raise suspicion, like, why have you been gone all night long? He changed back into his Boy Scout clothes or, night clothes or whatever he was wearing prior to arriving at Maureen's house, and frantically drove back to the Boy Scout camp out and slipped on in his tent like nothing ever happened. And it would take 8 days before poor Maureen's body was found in that ditch. In September of 1986, Dennis would take the life of 28-year-old Vicki Wegerle. Dennis chose Vicki after walking by her house one day and hearing her play the piano. I guess something about her piano playing struck his interest, and at that point he decided that she was going to be his next victim. So around 10 a.m. that morning, Dennis approached Vicki's home, pretending to be a phone repairman just to gain entry into her home. And once he was inside, he used a gun to take control, as he did with the previous murders. He forced her back to the bedroom where he tied her up, and somehow she was actually able to break free, and a struggle ensued. But after a short period of time, Dennis was able to gain control, and he then strangled her. And with Vicki, he actually took 3 Polaroid photos of her posed in different positions and kept those for himself. So after taking the photos, Dennis quickly left in her car, and her husband, Bill, actually was on his way home at the time, and I believe that Vicki had told him, my husband is going to be home soon. So when Dennis was leaving in Vicki's car, her husband passed him in his car and actually saw Dennis driving his wife's car and was kind of like, who was that? So then Dennis went and parked her car and changed his clothes really quick and then returned to his own car. One of the really sad things about this case is that Vicky's husband, Bill, was actually a suspect in the death of his own wife. And though he never was charged and convicted, he was under suspicion for 18 years. And it totally messed him up. It totally messed up his entire life. He knew he was innocent. Some people, obviously believed he was innocent, but there was always that cloud of suspicion that hung over him, which it ruined him. It ruined his life. In 1988, Dennis was actually fired from ADT. And though sometimes stuff like that, like a divorce or a loss of a job, is a trigger for, serial killers to, kill, he wouldn't actually claim another life until 1991. On January 18th of 1991, Dennis again was on or it is speculated that he was actually again on a Boy Scout campout when he made up some excuse and left the campout and made his way to 62-year-old Dolores Davis's home, where he broke the sliding glass door to gain entry. Dennis actually chose Dolores as his next victim based on her age. He had claimed that he started to get a little bit concerned with the fact that so many of his previous victims were able to fight back. I mean, Kevin got away, and several of the other victims broke from the restraints and were able to try and fight him off before he gained control. So he decided that he was going to go for more fragile victims, which is why he chose 62-year-old Dolores. So he broke her sliding glass door to gain entry, and as with the other victims, he strangled her, and then he put her in the trunk of her own car and drove her out to, placed her near a lake where he kind of covered her body with a little bit of brush and trees, like the previous one. And then he actually went back to Dolores's house, where he wiped down the house for any evidence, and he must have had some kind of scare, like thought maybe he had left something behind. So he went back and wiped everything down, and then he decided that he actually didn't want to leave her where he had placed her. He went back and got Dolores, placed her in the trunk, and drove her to another remote area where he would leave her. Then, like with the previous one, he rushed back to Boy Scout camp and was able to slip in as if nothing ever happened. And, obviously he wasn't caught for many, many years, so nobody ever suspected at that time that he was even gone, let alone that he was out doing these horrible things. So then the following night during the Boy Scout camp, Dennis left again and returned to where Dolores was, where he actually posed her body for some photographs. He also later took photographs of himself bound with a mask on in a grave that he had initially dug for her. It's pretty creepy. I mean, this guy's gross. So then shortly after Dolores's death, Dennis went on to become a compliance and animal control officer, which is probably the worst position you could put a narcissist like him in. He took full advantage of this job. He wrote tickets for grass being not the right length, or constantly complaining about dogs. I mean, he had so many complaints from members of the community as well as co-workers that he had worked with about how controlling and how and about his attitude and the way he handled his job. It was so bad that there were several community members that actually left Park City, where he was the compliance officer, because of him. They just couldn't handle it anymore, because they had complained and nothing was ever done. So it's like you're living in this house that you pay for, and you've got this dick constantly coming and saying your dogs are barking too much, or your grass is 1/8 of an inch too long, or your trash can is not. I mean, he would write tickets for shit like that, like a trash can being too far down the street, or some stupid bullshit like that. So in 2004, Dennis was elected the vice president of his church council. I mean, weird shit, right? Like, not only was he a member and took his family, his wife and his kids, and they did youth groups and, things like that, but now he was elected the vice president of the council of his church. This evil man who was out sneaking off during Boy Scout campouts with his own kids to murder innocent victims was a vice president of the council of a church. And around this same time, it actually was the 30-year anniversary of Dennis's first victim. So, he had first killed in 1974, and here we are in 2004. 30 years later, they still had no idea who he was. They had no idea he was in the area. And he's just, a compliance officer, a family man, a church council vice president, living his life, and nobody had any idea that it was him that had committed the Otero murders in 1974, as well as all the ones that would follow. So because it was the 30-year anniversary in 2004, and this case never really left people's minds, not just in that community, but pretty much everywhere. The Wichita Eagle did an article on the 30-year anniversary of the BTK, which, of course, because he lived there, Dennis actually saw. And it irritated him because, he's not getting the attention. And so after stewing on it for a little bit, he mailed the photos that he had taken of Vicki Wegerle at her home, as well as her driver's license, to the Wichita Eagle. That took place on March 17th, I believe. And then on May 5th, he sent Cake TV a word puzzle, which they realized was him because of the BTK symbols that he would always draw in his previous letters, but they couldn't really make out the words that were in the puzzle to understand what he was really trying to, the point or the message he was trying to get across. And then on June 9th of 2004, he taped a package to a stop sign containing a letter, with details about the Otero murders, and then a drawing of a woman hanging by a pipe by a noose. He also included a chapter list entitled BTK Story, all the different chapters that would become the story of the BTK. He's got to stroke his own ego. On July 17th, there was an envelope in one of the books in the Wichita Library that was found marked BTK. In it, there was a letter claiming that he had chosen his next victims and was already planning for it. So on October 22nd of that year, a UPS driver found an envelope taped to a box, one of the boxes that he was delivering, and in it was a bunch of collages of women that, had bindings on them and nooses and things like that. And he had also put a fake autobiography, like he thought that he was going to throw the police off by claiming he was born in 1939 or something like that, and that his father was this and that he did this for a living. The police knew it was fake, but after the FBI had kind of gone over these items, they had advised that they publicize this autobiography in the media. This was done because the FBI thought it was a good way to keep him communicating. If he was communicating and getting feedback from his communication, they felt that it would hopefully hold him off a little bit longer before he would act out on his urge to kill. They were right, So on December 14th, a man found a doll in the park with a bag over its head and its hands and feet tied, and attached was Nancy Fox's driver's license. So he had left that as another taunt, I guess. And then on January 9th of the following year, 2005, Dennis left a Special K cereal box in the back of a pickup truck in the parking lot of the Home Depot, and on it he wrote BTK and bomb. So the truck that the cereal box was dropped into actually was an employee of Home Depot. And, you know, once he got home and realized that this was in the back of his truck, he didn't really notice the BTK and all the writings and stuff, so he tossed it in the trash. And then a few weeks, he actually forgot to put his trash can out on the street, thank God, so it wasn't picked up. And then many days later, BTK actually called and tipped off police and reported that he had left this cereal, you know, box. And so they went to the Home Depot to search for this and found out that it was actually had been put in an employee's, you know, truck. And the employee went home and was able to actually retrieve the cereal box because he had forgot to put his trash out on trash day. And so while at Home Depot, they looked at video surveillance. Now, as I mentioned before, Dennis wasn't that bright, kind of, you know, always mediocre student. He didn't get good grades, and his communications throughout the years showed that his grammar sucked. He didn't know how to write. He didn't know how to spell properly. And I gotta wonder if he's just not the brightest in all areas, because he didn't realize that the Home Depot had surveillance. I mean, how do you not know that? So police, you know, looked at the Home Depot surveillance videos, and they watched for the time and the truck, you know, and to see when somebody had approached that truck. And they couldn't, it was too grainy to make out Dennis Rader and like any details to identify him, but they did see the black Jeep that he was driving at the time. But inside the cereal box, you know, was details on victims and stuff to, I guess in a way, prove that it was actually him. But he also in there wrote a question, and it said, if I put my writings on a computer disk, will it be traceable? So with the question, he instructed them to respond in the Wichita Eagle classified ads, and to give them his answer, you know, whether or not it's traceable. Like, are they going to tell you that it's traceable? Come on now, duh. And he told them in their answer to address Rex, so that he would know that it was for him. So the next drop or form of communication from Dennis was on January 25th. It was a cereal box leaning up against a road sign, and inside the box there was a doll with a plastic bag over her head, and she was hanging by a plumbing fixture. So obviously it was supposed to be Josephine, which is pretty fucked up. Like, it's fucked up that you did all that, but then you're gonna taunt law enforcement and use her as a means to taunt them, you know, this poor little innocent girl. I don't know. He then on February 3rd sent a postcard to Cake TV, and then they finally decided to respond to his ad after consulting with the FBI. You know, of course they're gonna go with what law enforcement tells them to do. And so they didn't want to just jump and say, yes, it's traceable, because they wanted him to send a disc, but they didn't want to say, no, it's traceable, in case he was trying to catch them in a lie and it would irritate him or agitate him more. And then in turn, he ended up, you know, killing quicker. So they had to kind of, you know, evaluate the situation, and ultimately FBI said, go ahead and, you know, let him know, no, it's not traceable. So they posted an ad in the classified, and it said, Rex, it will be okay. So on February 16th, a package came to KSAS News station there locally, and in the package was a floppy disk. It also contained some jewelry and a letter, of course, you know, so that they knew that it was BTK. So of course they analyzed the floppy disk. I mean, why wouldn't they? And, you know, they look at, there's ways to find like IP addresses and things like that. Well, upon evaluation of this floppy disk, they were able to connect it to the Christ Lutheran Church. So upon further investigation, that they realized that the church council vice president was a man that drove a black Jeep. So the black Jeep was Dennis Rader's, and they at that point put him under surveillance. And because they had, from multiple crime scenes, they had, semen that was left behind, and we're in 2004 now, so DNA is a thing. They were able to retrieve his daughter's DNA, I believe, from a local physician, and they ran the daughter's DNA against the samples that they had as evidence, and it showed a familial match, which means the DNA at the crime scenes is in fact a family member of BTK's daughter, Dennis Rader's daughter. So they knew at that point for a fact that Dennis was BTK. Dennis Rader was responsible for all 10 murders between 1974 and 1991. So on February 25th, 2005, Dennis Rader was arrested for the BTK crimes. He was initially quiet and didn't speak, but after a short period of time, he just opened his mouth. He started talking. He went into full detail about every single one of his crimes. It was a 30-hour confession by Dennis Rader. He just liked to talk. He liked to talk. He was a narcissist. He liked to talk about himself and all these things that he did. He claimed, that Factor X, again, was responsible, and that's what made him do the things that he did. And he also called them on lying to him about the floppy disk. It was like he felt that he had this kind of friendship or relationship with the people in law enforcement, or I think more with media. He felt like they were his friends or something, and that he was communicating with them. And he actually said that, basically he was like, I can't believe you lied to me about the floppy disk. The gentleman that he had been communicating with said, I had to. We had to catch BTK. So, during this time, they searched his home and they searched his office for evidence, to build their case, because although they had the DNA and now a confession, they still, you want as much as you can get. And they found all kinds of stuff. There were letters, there were BTK letters, there were newspaper clippings, there were photographs, there was jewelry, there was artwork that he had drawn, the stuff like that he had sent to the media of women, hanging by a noose and things like that. All this torture and gross, shitty artwork. On June 27th of 2005, in a courtroom, Dennis confessed, and it was broadcast and, filmed for live coverage. He went into detail. The prosecution was, asking him questions about each case, and he just nonchalantly opened his mouth and gave detail about everything that he had done. During the trial, the victims were able to speak and give their impact statements, and they spoke about how he affected them, the survivors of these victims. And then Dennis was allowed to speak and address the victims in the court, and apparently he spoke for 20 minutes. When Dennis spoke for those 20 minutes, he did at some point in there give a half-hearted apology, but the rest of it was like he was talking like he was making a speech, not like he was wholeheartedly sorry for how he had affected all the lives of these victims. He just talked like it was another day. So like Joseph D'Angelo, there was quite a bit of time that had gone by before Dennis Rader was identified, and there also was a few cooling off periods, which during those cooling off periods, he was being a family man and a church man, and trying to pretend that he was normal. But he claimed that during the entire time he was always trolling. The thoughts, his desires to kill and torture never ever went away, and that during these cooling off periods he would act out his fantasies on himself to be able to control the urge. So he would tie himself up and, you know, hang himself from and put a bag over his head and set a camera with an auto like trigger pull so he could take pictures of himself doing this. He would do things like he had done in the grave that he, you know, had returned to the site and took photos of himself bound and lying in that grave. And this was a way for him to live out his fantasies without actually killing. And then when that no longer satisfied him and the urge was too strong, he would then again go out and kill. On August 18th, Dennis was convicted of 10 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to 175 years to life in prison without the possibility of parole until the year 2180, which, you know, obviously he's going to be dead and gone. So Dennis will serve out the rest of his life behind bars, and though that doesn't bring anybody back that he killed, at least we know that he can't hurt anybody else. So I hope you liked the video, and please hit the subscribe button, and if you have any suggestions on maybe future videos, leave a comment, and I will see you next time. Thank you.